Good morning. Today is Wednesday, the 10th of Shvat, January 12th. We are here to study the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. In the moment, we are studying Masechet Shabbat, chapter 11. We are on 97. Well, we turned the page yesterday to 97b, but we'll start at the bottom of 97a today. We'll try to give a fast synopsis and try to clarify a little bit. I'm not promising you this is going to be the clearest few lines of Talmud, but we'll try our best to have some kind of picture of what's going on. And then we'll continue. Presently, we're in chapter Perek HaZorek, which is broadly talking about throwing stuff, which is a subdivision, a part of the general conversation about hotza'ah, causing an item to be transferred from point A to point B, from one domain to another. And we've been going through, thus far, a variety of scenarios and unique kind of circumstances where there's an interplay between multiple domains. And so generally speaking, hotza'ah or hachnasa means causing an item to go from one domain to another. That's, I don't want to say it's straightforward, but it's relatively straightforward. But once we're talking about three different domains, it gets a whole lot more complicated. Previously, we've been talking about something going from a private domain to another private domain via a public domain. And now, in the broader context, we're talking about something going from a public domain to another public domain, passing through a private domain. That's been the general gist of our discussion. Yesterday, we were introduced to a teaching that discussed or ostensibly presented the law of throwing something from a public domain to another public domain via a private domain. There was a machloket. And there is discussion about the exact nature of that machloket. The problem is, we need to understand what they're arguing about, and then we need to see if that's consistent with positions taken by the same authors in other contexts of the laws of Shabbos, which compels the Gemara to clarify that a certain teaching explaining that machloket, that debate, actually applied to a different rabbi. And what we gain, and we'll do a specific summary. I just want to give a general summary. So we have a teaching, a brisa. We have a clarifying teaching by Rav Hanan, taught in the name of Shmuel, I believe. And we have a variation of how that teaching was applied to a different discussion. In order to wade through this Gemara, we basically, what's the right word? We basically cross-check a series of different teachings to see how they work. And at a certain point, we abandon that discussion and go back to a previously rejected hypothesis and attempt to understand that. And so it feels like we kind of, there's a little bit of a sense that we walked away from a discussion midstream. When we see it inside, I hope it'll be a little more clear. But basically, that's just without giving any information, that's the overview. There's a debate. We're trying to understand what the debate is about. And once we assert that the debate is in a certain context, we cross-reference that with other discussions of the same rabbi, namely Rebbe, and that compels us to actually change a specific teaching and apply it to a different brisa by a different rabbi, not called Rebbe, called Rabbi Yehuda. Again, I don't think that's going to give you clarity, but that's just a very general overview. Before we jump into the text and try to extricate ourselves from it with some clarity, today is the 10th of Shvat, which is the yahrzeit of the previous Rebbe, an important day on the Chabad calendar, and the day that the Lubavitcher Rebbe, son-in-law of the previous Rebbe, agreed after a year of rejecting and not agreeing to accept leadership of Chabad in a formal capacity. He did so, and so it's a very special day in the Chabad calendar. It was a special day. It was a very special day to the Rebbe because it was the yahrzeit of his predecessor, his Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak. And just to point out really briefly, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, the previous Rebbe, sometimes referred to as the Rayatz. Rayatz stands for Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak. He lived approximately, he was a Rebbe for approximately 30 years. And each one of those 30 years, or I should say the 30 years, if you could broadly divide it into to 10, so 3 units of 10, each one, the previous Rebbe lived in some of the most challenging chapters in Jewish history. And it would appear that he was constantly fighting. He was constantly waging war against different forces that seemed almost insurmountable. And so the previous Rebbe loses his father, the Rebbe Rashab, in approximately 1920. 1920 is towards the beginning of the Russian Revolution, at a time where there was a very active campaign against rabbis, shuls, Judaism, and all facets of Jewish practice. And as much as the Soviets generally were opposed to Judaism, there was the Jewish division, the Yavseksia, which is probably not being pronounced and probably dropping off the latter part of the division. But the point is, it was a Jewish division, and they were incredibly passionate about outrooting any remnants of religion in the Jewish community. And I think the Soviet, the structure, there were other divisions that focused on different segments and ethnicities, but the Yavseksia, the Jewish division, was incredibly brutal, and they oversaw killings and the closing of Jewish schools and Jewish yeshivas and mikvahs and the like. And they also oversaw many Jewish rabbis and people that were trying to, and others. I don't want to make it only about rabbis. This is just the context of a rabbi. So, and so many people that were trying to uphold Jewish practice were killed, were sent off to the gulags or to Siberia and the like. And the previous Rebbe basically fights and wages an underground battle to push back, and he encourages anyone that will heed his voice to resist and to have underground educational institutions and to have mikvahs and shochets and mohels. And many of these people that were dispatched, almost all of them actually, were killed or died in the process of this. And it culminated, I don't want to say it culminates, because it actually got even worse later on in the 30s. And then after World War II, there were times that there was a thawing, and then things got worse again. In the 30s were absolutely brutal. But the point is, he himself is arrested in 1927. Initially, he's going to be killed. And it was a very strong lobbying effort by America and the State Department that has, and other political bodies and other governments, and got involved. And ultimately, his sentence is commuted. He's not killed. He's going to be in 3 years of labor, and then eventually he's actually entirely released. And he spends a little more time in the Soviet Union, and then he is actually compelled to leave. And we might call it a little bit homeless for a while. He paid a trip to Israel, and then he was in Latvia, and then he was in and eventually he settles in Poland. And Poland was actually, this is the interwar period, and Poland was actually in a little bit of a golden moment. I don't know if it was called a golden era, but there was a lot of Jewish activity, and he tries to rebuild Lubavitch, the Hasidic dynasty, as it was in Russia. And he also is very involved in promoting actually women's events, and also very active in trying to maintain his campaign to promote Judaism in Russia from outside, raising funds and trying to support, to the best of his ability, that infrastructure. And of course, as you know, approximately 10 years later, the Nazis rise to power. They invade Poland, and he miraculously escapes. Many of his family and Hasidim, and 6 million we know, perish in the Holocaust. And the previous Rebbe arrives to America. He's told that Judaism is finished and he should just come to terms with it. And he was very sick. He'd been beaten and he had many illnesses. And he's told to just relax and take it easy and try to recover and forget the old country, which is a common message that many Jews that came from the old country received. And he immediately declares that he refuses, and he fights his final battle the next 10 years, which he declared America's Nitanderish. And he insists on opening Chabad yeshivas and other yeshivas, and Baruch Hashem, other Rabbanim came over also in that period. And so there was, we had Litvish yeshivas, and there was, let's say Torah Masorah, but the previous Rebbe was instrumental in opening tens and tens of Jewish day schools across the Jewish world. Many of those schools still exist, actually. And if you come across a school called Achei Tamimim, or something to that effect, most likely it was founded by the previous Rebbe. So you have in Pittsburgh and in Buffalo and in Rockland County, and he made efforts then in Philadelphia and Detroit and on and on and on. the known Jewish world, Chicago. And long story short, he passes away 10 years later. And his son-in-law, who had already, although he was actually, in a sense, a layperson, the Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson of blessed memory, the Rebbe, his son-in-law, had a day job. And he actually was very determined to stay out of the rabbinate. And so all of his work in Chabad was a little bit more behind the scenes. He was in charge of Chabad's publishing. He was well, everyone knows he was a prolific Talmud Chacham, but he really didn't look for the limelight. And the Hasidim realized that if Chabad movement and the efforts of the previous Rebbe to be a force for Jewish life in America was going to continue, it needed to be the Rebbe who was behind the scenes involved in that. And it took a year, and eventually he agrees, and that is today. So that was all a long introduction to say 10th of Shvat, special day. Yes?
One more point. How unique is it that the Rebbe waited for a year, not only in Chabad, but the Hasidim generally? It's automatic. They know in advance almost who's going to succeed the existing Rebbe.
So I don't want to overstate it. I have a feeling that in certain Hasidic dynasties and moments, the successor plan is very strongly delineated, and I think that was the case with the previous Rebbe. And so immediately on the passing of his father, it was entirely evident that he would be the Rebbe. In this case, especially because the Rebbe wasn't interested in the job, and there was other brother-in-laws. So the Rebbe, it seems like, genuinely wasn't interested in the role, and so that's why there was this delay. But I wouldn't be surprised if other Hasidic dynasties occasionally do have that dynamic as well. So I couldn't give you an educated answer about that. Dr. Hammer?
Just to piggyback on your sites of Gedolei Hadar, I believe that today is the first yahrzeit of Rabbi Dr. Abe Twersky.
Oh my goodness! Well, then let's. Is it today?
Today or yesterday? It's. I read something from the shul that I got because he when he lived in Teaneck, he davened in Rinat, which is the shul that I davened in, and he would often speak at between Mincha Mariv and give a lot of chizuk and interesting.
Wow. So either way, yeah, he passed away on the English date. It was February 1st or January, end of January, 1st of February. And so, yeah, let us say l'chaim for it's next week is the yahrzeit?
His yahrzeit is the 19th of January. I mean, let's see what it is. That would be Yud Zion.
Yud Zion. Okay, so in a week.
Oh, okay.
17th of Shvat.
Go ahead, doctor. But it's good that you.
Okay.
It's good that you put the yahrzeit on our radar, because he's certainly deserving of a special introduction on his yahrzeit. And so let us. The 17th. Let us. So anyway, so that's that. So we could dedicate.
There's actually a live stream program next week
on the yahrzeit. Dr. Stamler?
Yeah. Let me ask you a question. The riots, how did he view? Did he have any writings that he wrote about the Holocaust? Because different Rabbanim wrote different things, different points of view.
So the Rebbe, so I can't give you like a specific answer. The answer exists, but what I do know is that for the entire war period, he was screaming at the American Jews to wake up to what's going on and to intervene and to get involved. And you read his writings and you hear, and again, he's not the only one, but you hear the absolute desperation and frustration that American Jewry don't seem to get what's really going on. And you can almost tell from his words, because many of them are published, the apathy or the unawareness or the disconnect that many American Jews had. And he's screaming and screaming, got it, And so I don't suppose that's precisely what you mean, but he was very he was very involved and active in trying to to do it, whatever he could to be involved, to help out the plight of European Jewry. And
this is unambiguous. It's obvious that he was trying to do that. A more difficult question is how we explain what happened in Europe. And if I remember correctly, the Rebbe said that.
You mean the ideological question?
Yeah, we are too close to the actual events to come up with an explanation, and this is why he rejected a number of explanations, such as it was all our fault, it was the punishment, and those other things, but simply said that we are speechless in front of it, and there should be some more time passed before he would be able to speak.
As far as commentary, yes. So that was the question.
That
I
was
mean,
the question.
Oh, okay, okay.
But which Rebbe, when, Professor, when you said Rebbe, which Rebbe do you mean? Did you mean the last Lubavitcher?
No,
Or
the last
right.
Lubavitcher, yeah,
The last.
our
Right.
Rebbe.
Yeah. So the Rebbe, the son-in-law of the
I would
previous
say that
Rebbe.
I was disappointed because I did I wanted to have an explanation, but this is what we wound up with.
Well, just to add to the conversation, in the late 80s, there were, well, if you know a little bit about Jewish rabbinic history, so there was like a lot of tension between certain rabbis and the Rebbe, and one of the areas of great contention was about exactly that, discussing the Holocaust. And so someone got up and basically said, a very important and prominent rabbinic leader said that, and I'm probably not accurately, I'm just going to paraphrase, but the gist was that the Holocaust was a result of religious failures. And because of these religious failures, if secular society in Israel persists, we're staring down the barrel of another Holocaust. That was again, that's a paraphrase, but that was the crux of what this person said. And the Rebbe was absolutely livid. And the Rebbe usually didn't call out individuals, but he spoke out and said, how dare a Jew wish ill on millions of Jews, and even to make that kind of statement in a public way to cause Jews to be fearful is the absolute opposite of what is accurate and true. And the Rebbe further said that to claim to know a reason and to claim to justify the cause for the Holocaust is terrible. And the Rebbe even used the words, Hashem doesn't need a lawyer, Hashem doesn't need an advocate to defend the reason for the Holocaust, and it's entirely inappropriate to try to lay blame at specific individuals. And the Rebbe described, that anyone that, again, also paraphrasing, that anyone that perished in the Holocaust, regardless of their observance, were kiddushim, and to cast blame, would be a terrible mistake. The Rebbe also, and this is maybe a little more controversial, but the Rebbe, I believe, did not like those who try to explain that the Holocaust was a necessary evil to set up the state of Israel. The Rebbe felt that God would not cause the death of 6 million just to facilitate Israel. Hashem could have had other ways. And so the Rebbe generally was opposed to trying to make specific claims. Again, there are rabbis out there that do this, but the Rebbe was very adamant that that was inappropriate and not only insensitive and wrong to scare people, but also, in the Rebbe's opinion, inconsistent with our belief system. And a Jew should be more comfortable saying Hashem does things, we don't understand them, and that's a more Jewish thing in the Rebbe's belief than to feel like we need to give an explanation and a justification to why Hashem would allow something to happen. And again, this is one of the biggest questions of our day and our age, but that was something in short. And this debate was very well publicized in the late 80s. That was when this conversation had happened. And that's enough filibustering for today. Let's jump into our Gemara, and with Hashem's help, we'll get through it, and we'll come out on the other side with some more clarity and appreciation for the discussion of the Talmud. But suffice it to say, today's a special day, l'chaim l'chaim, and we dedicate our learning for the complete and speedy healing and well-being of the members of our Chabura, their households, and for all of Klal Yisrael, and all the names that we have in our WhatsApp group. They should be blessed with a particular speedy, miraculous, and complete healing. And here we are in the Gemara. 97a, bottom of the page. I'm going to go through this again, but I'm going to try to give more clarification. Tana Rabbanan. Here is the brisa that makes all the trouble. The brisa says, Reshus harabim l'shus harabim. If one casts something from one public domain to the other, passing through a private domain, Rebbe mechayev chachamim poter. Rebbe says, liable. This is not okay. The chachamim say you're exempt biblically. There's a problem here, which elicits an analysis which is going to be rejected because of a inconsistency. But right now the Gemara asks,
And I'm gonna walk
comes-
over
yeah, I'm gonna
to,
hit-
where do you want to go first? You want to go to,
there's a problem. Because why would a person be entirely exempt for throwing something from a public domain to another public domain, passing through a private domain? That doesn't seem to make sense. And so Rav and Shmuel both add, first of all, you'll only be chayiv if you throw this through a enclosed space where we could imagine that the item landed conceptually, landed within the home. A closed space, you don't know what's happening, it's dark, it's damp, it might be full of things. And so even though in reality it's flying seamlessly through, we imagine in the, again, a halachic, I don't want to say fiction, but in the halachic perspective, the item lands, it's considered to have landed, and therefore a person is considered to have caused an item to travel from a public domain to a private domain. That's the first comment that Rav and Shmuel, everybody agrees. If it was just a open fenced-in area, or just a doggy park, it seems that everyone would agree that you would not be chayiv for causing something to go into a private domain. There are other problems that may be considered, but that would not be one of them. There's no debate. Here is the more complicated matter. What exactly are you chayiv for? Again, I want you to visualize clearly. You're standing in the public domain. You want to get your football into the other public domain, and it flies through a private domain. What are you chayiv for? So Rav Chana quotes Shmuel as saying,
I guess the problem is transferring. One of the problems besides going for amos in a public domain is transferring from private to public.
transferring from private to public and public to private. So the commentary of Shmuel is Mechayiv haya Rebbe. When Rebbe utters the words chayiv, he doesn't just mean that you're in trouble. Of course, you shouldn't do it. Of course, it's a problem to cause something to go from a public domain to a private domain. But in truth, mechayiv haya shtayim. You actually did two problems. Haitza hachnasa. Because remember, 3 domains means that there are 2 transfers between domains, from the public to the private and the private to the public. That's what Rebbe says. What's comforting to us about this statement is that now when the Chachamim say potter, they're not saying you're entirely potter. All they're saying is you're only chayiv 1 carbon. You're only chayiv 1 carbon. Yes, doctor.
Why is there a difference, according to Rebbe, between a roofed Reshut Yachid and an exposed one? If it's
So actually, there seems to be a general consensus this is the case, because an open air,
so
I hope I'm getting-
a backyard would not be considered.
a
even if it's
backyard,
lawn?
according to Rav and Shmuel, would not qualify for this halacha. We're talking about that there's a structure with a roof, it's enclosed, and you threw through one window and out the other window, where because it's enclosed, in the eyes of halacha, we imagine as if it landed within. It went inside a place, we imagine that it's thick, and anything that goes there lands, and then somehow it relaunches. Again, in reality, it's
But that's specifically for this halacha. In general,
correct.
a backyard would be considered Reshut Yachid.
Correct. Yes. Only for the purposes of saying it's like launched and relaunched, or something to that effect.
It seems to me that the issue about the number of karbanot should have been reason in the previous discussion when we were passing from private domain over public domain to another private domain. How many karbanot one should be higher? But it seems to me that, but it looks like they raised this issue for passing from public domain to public domain, but didn't raise it in the discussing the issue from passing from private domain to private domain through a public.
And a possible reason may have to do with
but the discussion is different.
Indeed. It's possible that it has to do with the question of the height took priority and was more of a priority discussion about 10 tefachim and higher. But so, in other words, Professor, if I could reframe what you're saying, once we finish this Gemara, it would be interesting to see if we could apply this principle back to the previous scenario where it's private to public to private. Indeed. So again, we have a text, we have a machloket. Rebbe says chayev, the Chachamim say potter. It's uncomfortable for us to say that the Chachamim mean that you're entirely off the hook. That's uncomfortable for us. It's more comfortable to say the Chachamim say you're only chayiv once. When we say Paitrim, we mean you're not chayiv for the second leg of the trip. And Rebbe says you're chayiv for both legs of the trip. That is essentially the case that Rav Chana conveys from Shmuel. Again, Mechayiv HaRabbi Shtayim, you're chayiv twice, once for causing the item to go into the private domain, and once for causing the item to go from a private domain to a public domain. That in itself should be clear. The problem is Rav Chana is going to express how this interpretation that he had from Shmuel doesn't jive with the teachings of Rebbe. Because Rebbe himself, based on what we know, should actually say you only bring one carbon. Because the Gemara is going to remind us of a teaching that we've seen a few times, that if you have a primary malacha and a subcategory malacha, you only have to bring one carbon. This question is a question that brings up the question. In response to the question, we are informed that this teaching, Mechayev HaYishtayim, actually has an alternate tradition. There was another tradition that doesn't say that they were talking about Rebbe. This same teaching that when a text says Chayev and Pater, it actually means 2 and 1, should be applied to actually a different brisa. So again, what's going to happen now is we're going to be introduced to a conflict within Rebbe's own opinion, which is going to cause the Gemara to say this teaching, but apply it to a different brisa with a different author. That's what's going to happen next. Yosef Rav Chana v'Kokashli. Rav Chana said, I have this teaching from my teachers. This is a tradition I have. But there's a big question. Does this mean that Rebbe agrees that one would bring 2 carbonis, one would be liable, even if you're doing 2 malachas of the same sector, the same segment, one a primary and one a secondary? And so we're going to bring a brisa that reminds us that Rebbe says that avot and toldot, primary and subcategory, were created primarily to inform us that there would only be one carbon when a person does 2 items of the same segment. So for example, Hotza'ah and Achnasa, they each get their own title, but they're really part of the same category of transferring items from one domain to the other. And therefore, Rebbe himself, based on what we know about his viewpoint, should only say you're chayiv once. And this is such a powerful and resounding challenge that we don't know what to make of Shmuel's comment. Again, remember the Mechayiv Rebbe Atolda Makamab. Does Rebbe really believe that one could have to bring a carbon for a tolda if he's also done the very av? So imagine a tree, and so you have out of the tree you have a primary. I'm trying to think of what the right any kind of diagram where you have a primary, you have a subcategory. So Rebbe says anything that comes out of that original point, it's one carbon. The Gemara therefore says as follows: Amar le Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef, who apparently was also a contemporary of Rav Chana, says Mar ahamasni la v'kashle de Rebbe. Your tradition that you conveyed from Rav Yehuda via Shmuel, the way it's presented is indeed a challenge. It's a problem. Anan, but Rav Yosef says we have the same tradition, the same teaching, with just a different name. And for us, it all makes sense. So there is a tradition from Shmuel that actually has a question. And we're kind of stuck at this question. We haven't given an answer to how Shmuel would be able to explain Rebbe's sudden departure from his well-known, well-publicized opinion that an Av and a Tolda only bring one carbon. Dr. Hammer?
No, I'm good.
Okay. Rabbi Yosef says, but there's a varying way that this very teaching was conveyed. And with this variation, we have no problem. Why do we have no problem? Anan, Rabbi Yehuda says, I got this teaching about Rabbi Yehuda Masninan. It was taught about another brisa with a teaching from someone named Rabbi Yehuda. Now, I could understand, although the commentaries don't make this point, I could understand why you might have a tradition and the name in that statement is lost. You know why? Because Rebbe was also called Rabbi Yehuda. And so it's not shocking that, because even we, I shouldn't say even we, of course we in our, conversation could occasionally refer to Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi as Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, and sometimes we call him Rebbe. So it's not beyond our imagination that there could be a teaching that's passed down, and along the tradition, maybe there was a mistake about who the subject of that statement was. And so Rav Chana was told this teaching with the name Rebbe, and it's actually a big problem. It's not really resolved. Anan ad Rabbi Yehuda masnin, on this very teaching about when it says chayiv and pater, it means two, chayiv doubly. V'lo kashalan, and we have extricated ourselves from this problem because Rabbi Yehuda could allow a person to need to bring two karbanot, even if it's an avana tola. That's essentially what he says. Professor, at this point, are we clear? Clear enough. Rashi, Rabbi Kashi leid Rabbi Ad Rabbi. Rabbi Yehuda lava ha'amra ela ad Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda's comment was about Rabbi Yehuda. And we don't have a clear, explicit statement from Rabbi Yehuda, where he would say that you only bring one offering if you did a Toldan Av. So it's possible that Rebbe and Rabbi Yehuda disagree. They argue about what to do if you did two actions, one a primary and one a subcategory. And it's actually much more comfortable to say that Rabbi Yehuda would say that you did hoitzah, you did achnasa, you brought something from a public to private, private to public, and you could be chayiv twice. That's consistent with Rabbi Yehuda. It's not consistent with Rabbi. So at this point, we should all take a deep sigh of relief. Everything, balance has been restored. Everything makes sense. And the Gemara is now just going to tell us what the brisa that the teaching was about. So we're now going to basically start over. We're going to see a brisa, and we're going to apply this principle of two, in trouble twice to the new brisa. That's going to be simple, but then the Gemara is going to challenge that, and that's where it gets confusing again. So again, the Tanya, here is the brisa. New brisa, new authors, new people, new opinions. What happens if you're throwing an object from your house into Times Square? And what happens is the item ends up flying past where you expected it to land. And so you didn't just transfer the item from your private domain to Times Square, it actually lands deep into the crowd. Rabbi Yehuda mechayev and Chachamim pleitrim. Yehuda says you are chayev. Chachamim pleitrim, and you are exempt. Before we look at the Gemara's analysis, what would you imagine a person would be chayev for in this scenario? Again, you have your football, somebody's standing right you're in your house, someone's standing right in the edge of Times Square, you want to throw the football to him, bad idea. And it's on Shabbos, so it's a terrible idea, but that's what you want to do. And you end up overthrowing. It happens, by the way, even in professional football, certainly in amateur football, or maybe it's not a football at all. And you overthrow past your mark, past your target. Rabbi Yehuda says you're chayiv, the Chachamim say you're patur. Hold on a moment. What does Rabbi Yehuda say you're chayiv for? What did you do wrong? Anyone want to chime in?
What's the difference?
Just digging.
What's the difference how far into the public domain you go? The minute you cross your public domain, who cares? 10
Oh,
feet?
Rebel. So you're asking
less than 4 amos, it wouldn't be higher.
Oh,
No,
so
but here
here,
it's overthrowing.
Rebel, you're asking a good question. So let me just explain. There are two possibilities of what you're in trouble for. Option A is that you caused an item to fly from private domain to public domain. That's
Right.
called hotza'ah. That's classic hotza'ah. But now there's another problem. You caused something to travel 4 amos in the public domain. That's called ha'avara. And that's also malacha and Shabbos. And so, Beryl, your question is the crux of the analysis that's going to follow. What does it mean that Rabbi Yehuda says that you're chayiv? And how in heaven's name would the Chachamim say that you are patur? Patur? You should be patur if you cause an item to travel from one domain to another, and then to make matters worse, it traveled 4 amos and you're off the hook. Does that make sense? At this point, it doesn't make sense. Spoiler alert, in a few lines from now, the Gemara is going to make the case that maybe you should be entirely exempt. It's unfathomable to us in the moment, but the Gemara will give us some rationale, and it may make sense. But at this point, it's absolutely shocking that we should have a text, a brisa with authority that says, Chachamim potrim, you are off the hook for this act. You should not be off the hook for this act. Therefore, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, therefore Rabbi Yosef tells us that he has a tradition from Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel about Rabbi Yehuda. And I know this is confusing. Rabbi Yehuda is a rabbi of the Gemara. Rebbe Yehuda is a rabbi of the Mishnah. Rebbe Yehuda's name is brought in a brisa. Rav Yehuda is analyzing the brisa. It's confusing because there's the same name, but that's where we have to look. Rav Yehuda means Amora, Rebbe Yehuda, brisa. Usually the title Rav is, I know I'm giving you a little too much information now maybe, but Rav is usually Babylonian. Rebbe is usually what we might call in old scholarship Palestinian, but I mean from Israel, from the Mishnah. Mishnah happens in Eretz Yisrael. So again, based on this teaching, where Rabbi Yehuda says Chayiv and Chacham say Pater, chimes in Rabbi Yehuda, quoting Shmuel to say Chayiv Hoyer Rabbi Yehuda Shtayim. In truth, when he says Chayiv, it doesn't mean you're Chayiv once. Of course you're Chayiv once, but you're actually Chayiv twice. Why twice? Achas mishum ha'iksa. Number one, you caused the item to go from the private domain into the public domain. The moment your football flew out of your home into Times Square, you immediately check the box of called hoitza. You caused the item to travel. But that's not all. To make matters worse, achas mishum havara. You're also liable a second time because you caused something to go for amis in the public domain. And so you have a kind of, anyways, okay, so that's what Rabbi Yehuda says. Now the Gemara is going to bring proof that this is the only reasonable interpretation. You think Rabbi Yehuda would only say the person is chayiv once? Michlal, we can then immediately infer the Rabbanan Patri Legami, the rabbis here who say Patrim means you're entirely exempt. And that does not make any sense. That runs contrary to everything we know about Shabbos. How could you be allowed to take something and throw it from one domain to the other? That's never allowed. That's not kosher. That's like Shabbos 101. That's basics. That's after a few days in Masechah Shabbos. We already know that. This is a fundamental. So that is implausible. And therefore, it makes a lot of sense that Shmuel's interpretation is correct. When Rabbi Yehuda says Mechayiv, of course you're Chayiv once. They're saying that you're Chayiv twice. The Chacham say you're only Chayiv once. That makes a lot of sense, right? Again, if you would read this brayso any other way, then Michlal the Rabbanan Patri Legamri, you would have to say that the rabbis say that the person who threw the item from Times Square from your house into Times Square, you're entirely pater. He's caused something to travel from one domain to the other. How could you be pater? Therefore, this statement makes sense. Gemara says, no, maybe not. Let's consider the alternative. Mimai, how do you know? Let's try to imagine the alternate way of deciphering the text. So again, we have a brayso. Talks about the football going from the private domain into the Times Square. And we know that Rabbi Yehuda is mechayiv in the Chacham Patri. Our initial instinct says it's got to mean you're chayiv twice versus once. But let's imagine if we didn't have this teaching. Let's imagine that a way that the Chachamim might actually make you entirely exempt. Maybe in truth, Rabbi Yehuda says you're only in trouble once. Rabbanan Patri Legamri. And the rabbis say you're off the hook. How is it possible that a person could be exempt after throwing the football from their home into Times Square? I'll tell you how. If the person was really, really intending and hoping that it would land right in the beginning of the public domain. If your intention is, I'm throwing the football and I'm practicing my precision, or maybe and you wanted it to land right in the beginning. You never wanted it to travel for Amos in the public domain. Rashi. Hold on. Now, why would you be pater? Hold on. This is the crux of the debate. Rabbi Yehuda Savar Amrina and Kluta Kemasha. Rabbi Yehuda says, as soon as something travels through the airspace of a new place, it's as if it's come to rest. Let's say like this. I want to throw, I have to change my example now maybe. Forget a football. I'm standing in my house and I want to get something out of my house into the public domain for whatever reason. But think about it, a public domain is busy. Throw something into the middle, it's going to get run over. It's going to get trampled upon. So let's say you, Dafka, wanted it to land right in the edge of the public domain. That's what you want. Now, the unique thing about Shabbos is that a person's machshava, a person's kavana, is very essential to the malacha. It has to be maleches machshavas. It has to be with intention, with desire. If something doesn't happen the way you intend, that could have strong bearings on the consequences of the action. So now, again, I'm throwing my football, or I'm throwing my, I don't know, give me another example. I'm throwing my talis.
Rabbi.
Someone left a, hold on, please. I'm throwing the talis out of the shul and I want it to land right in the edge of the public domain. I throw it, but I am not the best quarterback in the universe. And so I overthrow my destination. So can we say that what I wanted to do happened or not? Rebbe says what you intended to do happened. You know why? Because in the eye of halacha, when something is soaring through the air, we imagine that it's on the ground. Let's read it inside. The Rebbe says you're chayiv. You know why? Amrinan kaluta kimashahuncha. Something is soaring through the air. We imagine it's at rest on the ground. And so in the eyes of halacha, even though I overthrew my target, the moment it soared into the public domain, the eyes of halacha view the football that is on the ground, and then it travels further. But the moment it entered into the airspace of the public domain, in the eye of halacha, it's on the ground. I got what I wanted, and therefore I am chayiv. Rabban and Sabri, the rabbis say, no way. We don't imagine, we don't have this imaginary legal fiction that because something's soaring through the air, it's on the ground. And therefore, this event is an utter disappointment. And let's be honest, a quarterback who overthrows his receiver, it's an utter disappointment. And if it's a losing, if it causes you to lose the game, you're terrible. It's bad for your stats. And as Eli says, you could end up back on the what's it called? Back on the sidelines. Yeah, you could be in trouble. And so, is it plausible that a person could be exempt after throwing an item from one domain to another? Well, at this moment, the Gemara is open to considering that as a possibility. We didn't say this is a halachic fact, but it is open for consideration. And therefore, this is a legitimate way to understand the Brisa that would reject Shmuel's comment that Rabbi Yehuda says Chaim Shtayim, and the Chachamim say you're potter from two carbonis, but you're chayv once. Rabbi Beryl, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was thinking of a more practical example.
Okay.
Presuming that you're throwing whatever it is to someone,
right?
So you tell him to come closer to the border, to be within 4 amos, and then you overthrow him.
So again, the truth is, I'm trying to give an example just to help us visualize it, but the idea of a receiver is something that doesn't really belong here. It only belongs in the analogy. We're talking about the intended.
Let's say you're intending to throw it within the 4 amos, and you overthrow.
Yeah. So
I have a question.
Yes.
What happens if you walk into shul and you find a big stack of money?
Hold on, let's try to stay focused on the matter at hand. It's confusing enough as it is.
It's about carrying. It's about carrying. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but but let's try to make sense of this first. And then we can always don't forget it. Bring it back. But let's try to first wade through this Gemara. It's a hard Gemara. So yeah. So b'hakam again, this is a theory. This is a hypothetical. I could, sometimes in a debate you want to consider all options, and so you have to game out all the ways of. So the Gemara now is saying, I could game out for you a way to read this text, and you should be entirely exempt for throwing, because maybe if it doesn't land where you intend it, maybe that's not called you did what you wanted, and maybe if you don't have what you wanted, you are exempt. Let's read Rashi. Rashi is commenting on the explanation that Rabbi Yehuda says, the moment it ends up in the airspace, we see it on the ground. We imagine that it landed right when it crossed into the public domain. Therefore, he has committed the act of Haitzah by virtue of throwing something from the public domain, and it lands imaginarily in the private domain. But Rashi explains why you wouldn't be chayiv for also causing the item to go 4 amos in the public domain. because that's not why. Afagav the chashav lekama shehuncha v'nekra huncha mishmad. Have you told him makamav? You're not chayav for avor because that's not what you wanted. Now, although you caused the item to travel through two domains, public to private and then private to public, so maybe you should be chayav twice. Rashi says in this havamina, in this theoretic explanation, you only bring one carbon because it's an av and a tolda. Haitzah and achnasa are so similar, and one is a primary and one is a subcategory. You're only chayiv once in this hypothetical reading. So in other words, we have a brisa. Rabbi Yehuda says chayiv, the chacham say pater. We have a way to read it that he means you're chayiv twice. But we also have a way to read it that Rabbi Yehuda agrees with Rebbe, and he agrees with the common sentiment that if you do a tolda and a av, you do a primary and a secondary, you only bring one carbon. So this is a way to explain the brisa. And the Gemara says, Lo yisal kadaitach, I don't like this. This can't work. Why can't it work? Because we know that Rabbi Yehuda actually believes that you are chayiv for an av and a tolda. By the way, this is also, we're still middle of a thought process. So don't take anything that we say conclusively, but we're mentally sparring. We're going back and forth. So the Gemara says, no, I don't agree that Rabbi Yehuda says you're only chayiv once. Titania, Rabbi Yehuda moisif apashoyvet amidakti. There's a brisa that talks about the 39 melachas. And believe it or not everybody thinks there are 39 melachas. Rabbi Yehuda adds additional melachas. Rabbi Yehuda adds 2 melachas. Which are they? Shoyvet v'amedaktek. 2 parts of the weaving process. Shoyvet is fixing up in a professional manner, fixing up the thread that runs in 2 directions, and medaktek. Well, actually, I guess medaktek is pushing them down, something to that effect. Rashi imshar of afa shoyvet imshar aves melachis la damar de lakach nimnu shmasam helmechad chayva kol achad achad shoyvet. Anyways, there's nuanced specifics in the weaving process. Amr loi, so they push back and say, Rabbi Yehuda, why do you add these 2? Shoyvet harihu b'chal meisech. The act of shoyvet, and again, I don't want to get into the specifics of the weaving process. Suffice it to say, lining up is very similar and related to stretching the threads of the warp under the loom. And medaktek, hariu b'chol oirig, beating and getting all the threads into position is part of weaving. And so why does he feel the need to add these 2 items that are quite obviously part of the malachis? Probably Rabbi Yehuda is trying to teach us that if you do 2 acts in the same moment, you're chayiv twice. Probably will infer from here that Rabbi Yehuda says you are chayiv twice. And with this comment, the Gemara has resuscitated and revived the interpretation that Rabbi Yehuda says if you're chayiv twice, once for causing it to move from one domain to the other, and the other for causing it to travel 4 amas in the public domain. So again, we're doing a kind of tennis, table tennis, ping pong, where we're trying to understand how to decipher the brisa. And at this point, we are once again sticking with the interpretation that Rabbi Yehuda says you're chayiv twice, because even if you do an av and a tolda, you do a primary and a secondary, you have to bring 2 karbonis. Gemara says, who says mimai? I think you've misread and misinterpreted the brisa that says that Rabbi Yehuda adds 2 malachis to the list of 39. Maybe the Mishnah or the brisa that adds the extra 2 malachis is not talking about that you did them in one shot. Maybe you did them separately. Rabbi Yehuda told him, and therefore Rabbi Yehuda does not believe that you are chayiv twice. Rabbi Yehuda actually thinks these 2 added details are primary categories. Rabbanan and Savri Hani told us, again, I went through this a little fast. Suffice it to say, there's a brisa that adds 2 malachis. Our initial reading is that they were told us, and he's trying to teach us that you could be chayiv twice. But the Gemara pushes back and says maybe Rabbi Yehuda actually wanted them to be avos malachis. If Rabbi Yehuda says that the 2 added ones are avot, then Rabbi Yehuda does not believe that you'd be chayiv for an av and a tolda in the same shot, thus compelling us to read the brisa saying that you're only chayiv once. Rabbi Yehuda says you're chayiv once, and the Chachamim say you're chayiv 0.
Rabbi, what happens what happens if you throw it against the wind and it goes beyond 4 amos and then it comes back to you?
So
A boomerang.
let's put that aside, assuming, because it's going to be discussed soon, assuming it's not your intention, well, then your primary trouble is going to be if your intention was carried out. A boomerang is where you intentionally intended to travel, so then you certainly be chayiv. If the wind interfered, that's a good question, and I think the Gemara is going to have a related teaching soon. And the Gemara ultimately embraces the viewpoint that Rabbi Yehuda should say that you're only chayiv one time if you do an avana tolda. And so at this point, the Gemara seems to be blowing up, or at least challenging Shmuel's teaching that Rabbi Yehuda says you're chayiv twice. And so we're kind of left in trouble, the way I understand this anyways, 2 times. Rebbe, the teaching as it pertains to Rebbe is a little bit challenging. And the same teaching as Rabbi Yosef conveyed it, applying it to Rabbi Yehuda, the brisa of overthrowing is also going to be a little bit troublesome because that teaching doesn't fit. And the Gemara managed to explain the brisa in a way that doesn't need that interpretation. Teida, the Gemara says, you know what? We are inclined to accept that Rabbi Yehuda meant to add 2 avot and not to consider them toldot. Because look at the wording, Rabbi Yehuda Moisef. My Moisef, Moisef Avos. If we're talking about primary categories, it makes a whole lot of sense that we're talking about primary categories. Now, the Iyamir's told us, but if Rabbi Yehuda is chiming in, we're having a conversation about apples, and he chimes in to talk about oranges, then it's not an addition, it's a separate conversation. Itmar Nami, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yosef, Tamit Tarbayu, Lechiv, Rabbi Yehuda, La'achas. And indeed, Rabbi and Rav Yosef, notwithstanding the tradition they had from an earlier generation, they ultimately conclude that Rabbi Yehuda says you're only chayiv once. In other words, folks, our Gemara seems to conclude that Rabbi Yehuda says you're only chayiv once, and the rabbis are saying that you're entirely patur because, Dr. Hammer, you should like this, machshava, intention, is super, super relevant to the point where an overthrow is not just an overthrow. You didn't do your intention. You did something else. And that something else, it's something, but it's something else. And it doesn't align with your machshava. And the Chachamim seem to be saying that you're entirely patur. Shocking. Shocking.
Rabbi.
That seems to be the conclusion of the Gemara. Yes, Beryl.
What about the opposite situation? You want to throw something, it hits a wall, and it never gets thrown. How do we deal with that?
Rebel, that's a very wise question. I mean, I know you always say wise things, but when the Gemara says something similar, I know it's wise. So with Hashem's help, the Gemara is going to talk about underthrowing, where you don't even reach your destination. It's a little bit of a different context, and so don't forget your question because we'll ask it again. But let's first see how the Gemara considers an underthrow. Is an overthrow and an underthrow the same thing? Or do we consider an underthrow 50% towards your destination? And it probably depends which sport you like to play. If it's considered halfway or if a miss is a 0. I'll say probably in most sports today, most popular American sports, missing is 0, right? You overthrow the receiver in football, it's not going to work. You miss the basket even by a bit. You don't get the point. And if the baseball doesn't go out of the park, it's not a home run, but then maybe it's a double. So maybe baseball, Dr. Hammer, is the right analogy here. So
intention doesn't help you in sports.
Indeed. So, but we're not there yet. We're going to get there. Actually, at this point, we're going to get there tomorrow. So, Professor, are you on with us? Help me out. Is it a little clearer now? You're muted. You know the story of the Balatanya, the Alter Rebbe, they asked him in prison, they interrogated him, they asked him a question, and he answered all the questions. And the last question, he just smiled. He didn't answer. And he was trying to say, what do you want from me? I've done a good job until now. I've been as forthcoming as I can. You don't want to hear this answer.
No, the sports analogies are even more difficult for me than the Gemara examples, because for all those years that I am in this country, I didn't get understanding of baseball and American football.
Right, but I'm saying with the outline of the Gemara, we have a teaching we have a brisa, we have a teaching. The teaching and the brisa don't seem to work so perfectly, and so the Gemara then says maybe it was said in another context, and ultimately we reject that as well. And that's basically the outline of our Gemara. Does chayiv and pater mean twice versus once, or does it mean once and zero? And we tried to make it work with the first teaching was from the public to the private to the public, and that didn't seem to work out so well. And then we tried to apply it to the case where you overthrew, and there too we are comfortable saying that Rabbi Yehuda only intended to cause you to be chayiv once, and the Chachamim are comfortable saying your pater, the lo yisavida machshavtei, what his intention was, never came to fruition. That's the very short recap of today's Gemara. Let's just take a peek, because this next Gemara references a previous Gemara, but this is an interesting style Gemara. Let's just start reading. We're going to probably have to continue tomorrow. Amalei Ravina Rav Ashi. Ravina tells Rav Ashi, listen, I know ultimately our conclusion is you're chayiv only once, according to Rabbi Yehuda, and zero to the Chachamim. But let's go back to our initial understanding before we were corrected. Based on our original understanding, the Mechayev Rabbi Yehuda where Rabbi Yehuda says you're chayiv twice, once for causing an item to go from one domain to the other, and second for causing it to go 4 amas. If he wanted it to go to one point, he wanted it to go to the other point, and vice versa. So you should be entirely exempt according to Rabbi Yehuda too, because what you wanted to happen never happened. Amar Lehi says you're right. We have to say that here, I don't care where it lands. If you don't care where it lands, and then you cause it to go 4 amas, so then you should be in trouble twice. But if indeed what you hope to happen didn't happen, it is plausible that Rabbi Yehuda too would say that you are pater. Again, this is all in the hypothetical. This is all in our original. This is all in to make sense of a rejected perspective, which is an interesting thing for the Gemara to do. The Gemara concludes, you must have said, I don't care where it lands. If you don't care where it lands, then wherever it lands, you've done Haitzah, and it's also traveled 4 amas. Something to that effect.
So what happens if you just throw a ball up in the air and you want to catch it again, like just throwing it up, and the wind carries it over to the public domain?
So then we would certainly say that was not your intention.
No.
Even if you threw it into the public domain and it didn't work out, there's a chance that you'll be exempt. But certainly if you only wanted to throw it up, and listen, this is a common issue. Kids are playing ball all the time.
That's right.
The ball goes into the yard, the neighbor's yard. It wasn't their intention, but it happened. So for the purposes of Shabbos, would they be chayiv? No, but for the purposes of aggravating the neighbors to the point of whatever the neighbor does, that's a... growing up, we had neighbors who lived behind us, and we would frequently lose stuff in their yard, and they would lose stuff in our yard.
You have to go to Nizikin.
Indeed. All right, that's today's Gemara. Folks, thank you all for being here today. With Hashem's help, tomorrow will be a whole lot more simple and straightforward. I want to thank you for your patience, for your grit and willingness to hold on as we go through the Gemara. Hoping everyone has a healthy, happy, well-adjusted, prosperous, worry-free day.
Thank you.
And looking forward to seeing everybody tomorrow. Please note, tomorrow it'll be a different link. It's a different link than usual because it's Thursday after Rosh Chodesh. And so I'm going to send on the group the alternate link. And we'll give an extra minute or two to allow everyone to get on. But please beware, please be prepared, and please note that tomorrow it's a different link. Have a wonderful, blessed day. Chumash will start in just a moment. Thank you all. Have a blessed